Okay, well, here we are at noon on the dot, Wednesday, May 21st, 2025. I'll let folks begin filtering in for this third installment of REAP's 2025 Spring Energy Speaker Series. Today's webinar is titled Harvesting the Midnight Sun, and it's all about annual net metering, the concept, and also its potential here in Alaska's Railbelt region. I'll introduce our esteemed speaker who will start the presentation in just a few minutes. But first and foremost, I want to introduce myself and our organization. My name is Donovan Rusoniello. I'm the Outreach Director for Renewable Energy Alaska Project. We're a statewide nonprofit organization, up to 15 full-time staff now, largest ever. We continue to grow, and we're all about educating Alaskans about where their energy comes from, the energy efficiency and renewable energy opportunities available to them, and then building the workforce and advocating for policy solutions to help accelerate the development of our local renewable energy resources and to build a more efficient energy system across the state. And so, really excited for this topic today, all about a policy solution that could help to incentivize action in that direction. Also, just want to ground us, as always, in the lands that we're zooming in from today. I work for REAP in Anchorage, which is Dena'ina Elnena. So I live and work on the homeland of the Dena'ina peoples, who for thousands of years have cared for the land, water, and animals of this place. Their stewardship, past, present, and future, makes Anchorage the place it is today. Um, and my colleagues and I acknowledge the Indigenous history embedded beneath our feet and recognize with deep gratitude the importance of their leadership and sovereignty here and throughout the world, and especially draw inspiration from their practices for using their local resources in a sustainable manner. And so we bring that to our work every single day. And as I mentioned, our organization, REAP, is not only a nonprofit organization with a lot of staff, but we also represent a coalition of over 60 dues-paying member organizations, from Alaska Native corporations and nonprofits to developers, utilities, educational institutions, local governments, all aligned around that mission of accelerating our local renewable energy and energy efficiency resources. And so we'll just put the plug in for folks who aren't yet REAP members or want to learn more about our organization. Check out our website and reach out to me. But on that note, I do want to introduce our speaker and get straight into the presentation this afternoon on a really timely topic. Erin McKittrick is a co-owner and author at alaskaenergy.org, a really great resource and blog where Erin and others share their analysis into the material impacts of decisions to be made for energy systems across the state. She's a self-professed independent energy analyst and professional meddling geek in informal settings, but Erin is also a REAP member and a longtime member of our public policy committee. And she's also a board member for Homer Electric Association, although it is important to note that she's not here in that capacity today. So with that, I'll hand it off to Erin to get started with the presentation. Just a final note, logistically speaking, we are recording this, so it'll be available afterwards. And then for folks who are attending today, we've got a great turnout. As always, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, affiliation, and Indigenous lands where you're zooming in from. And then also please remember to log your questions for Erin using the Q&A function so we can make sure and address those during the portion at the end. We'll leave at least 10 minutes for all of that at the end. But without further ado, thank you, Erin. Please go ahead and get started.
All right, thanks for having me. I'm just going to share my screen here. Um, all right, hopefully that works for everybody. Let me know if you can't see it. Thanks for that introduction, Donovan. And I am here to talk about annual net metering. So first, a quick roadmap. I'm going to start off by just explaining net metering in general, how it works today, and then the difference between monthly net metering and annual net metering. Then we'll look at the economics on the customer side of this. And then after that, why net metering rules, whether annual net metering or the regular monthly kind, is controversial, and how the economics of that work on the utility side. And then I'll be available for questions after that. So first off, what is net metering? So net metering is a rate structure. It's the rules that determine how money moves around when somebody has their own solar panels, but those are tied to the grid. So in Alaska, all the Railbelt utilities have a net metering rate structure and are required to do so by law. And outside of the rail belt, the non-economically regulated utilities usually could choose to have one or not. I'm not sure how many do. So the homeowner owns solar panels, they're attached to their house, and their house is attached to the grid. So the solar panels, they produce energy, goes into the house uses some of that energy, whatever appliances are on, and then if there's extra that the house doesn't immediately use, that flows onto the grid. Then at other times, when the solar panels are producing less than the amount the house is using, electricity flows just like it would for any customer from the grid to the house. And so you put some numbers on this as an example. You have these solar panels made 300 kilowatt hours. House used about half of that directly. The rest flowed onto the grid. And then the house bought 400 kilowatt hours. And so what net metering means is that you take those right 2 hour arrows, that 150 and the 400, and you add them up. You basically pay your bill based on the net consumption. So in this case, this customer is going to pay a bill on 250 kilowatt hours. So if that customer happened to be on the Chugach grid, their bill for this month would be about $72. And so this example doesn't actually look like most of the months would look here in Alaska. So what does it actually look like at different times of year? So this is my same example customer. This example customer is actually an average house on the Chugach grid with 6 kilowatts of solar panels, what that should be producing. And so you can see in June here, that arrow is pretty big. The solar panels are producing a lot of energy. The house uses some, but the house isn't using in June nearly as much as it's producing. So that net is actually negative. More energy is flowing out to the grid than the house uses, even across the whole month. And if you look instead at December, it's exactly the opposite. The amount of energy those solar panels producing is so small you can't actually even see the arrow. And I think, in fact, the line thickness is bigger, so that's why you have that random little line. And the house is instead pretty much just buying a bunch of energy from the grid. And so because net metering is monthly, each of those months gets calculated separately. So in June, the house actually has a negative bill, negative $12. That sounds pretty good, but only half of that solar production is getting that full retail rate because it's producing more than it makes. So of that, say 800 kilowatt hours it's producing, half of it goes to house consumption or gets netted versus the export. And then the other half is just like wholesale power sales. So anything extra it makes is treated by the utility just as if it was an independent power producer selling energy, and that energy is worth about 8 cents a kilowatt hour instead of the 23 that it's buying electricity for. And then in December, the bill is $170 because basically the solar panels are producing pretty much nothing and the house is just buying power. So what annual net metering does, in effect, is to average this all out. It lets, oh, I forgot, this is the yearly bill total in this situation, $780. So what annual net metering does is it basically averages all out by letting the customer take that extra power in June that they were going to sell at the 8-cent wholesale rate, and instead letting them save it up as credits to save up for the winter. And so the impact is as if you averaged that all out. And the yearly bill total now for the exact same house with the exact same solar panels and the exact same consumption is a couple $100 less, just from being able to take that excess power and roll those credits over. So in this last legislative session, House Bill 164 was the bill introduced by the governor that would do this, that would make net metering annual in this way. So all the graphs I'm showing are using details from that bill, but the concept is general. So it's been brought up before and it could be brought up again in a different format. So next, I just use this single example house on the Chugach system and generalizing that. What does it look like across the Railbelt for a bunch of different possible solar installations? So now you get a bunch of different graphs here, and this is looking at an average house in every different Railbelt territory. So a house that uses the average amount of electricity for that utility. And I'm using houses here throughout. Rooftop solar and net metering doesn't have to be on houses. Businesses can use this too, but it's a little bit harder to do the calculations because there is no average business, and because depending on their size and the utility, businesses can sometimes have more complicated rate structures, especially the larger ones, and net metering isn't always as beneficial for them. So yeah, here we have our average house, and you can see, as you put more solar on the house, the annual payments, the annual bills go down. And the difference between that fat light blue-gray line and the black one is the difference between monthly and annual net meter. So if the system is really tiny, it doesn't make much difference. The house never produces more energy than it uses in the course of a month, and it works out exactly the same. As those solar systems get bigger and bigger, there are a lot of summer months where the house is producing more than it can use in that month. And so the benefit is less. And the dashed lines show basically a net zero system at each utility. So that's how much solar this average customer needs to produce the same amount they use in a year. And so that kind of, once you get down to that level, the bills won't drop any further. This is because, at least in the current legislative bill, that extra power above what you use in a year isn't compensated at all. Another thing to note on here is that the lowest bill possible in most of these areas is just equal to paying the monthly customer charge every month. But in HEA, it's significantly higher than that. And that's because HEA has this separate minimum payment, basically. You have to, if you don't buy 150 kilowatt hours in any given month, you have to pay the minimum payment up to that amount. And so in practice, that kind of means you have to pay about $50-ish a month, no matter what. So this is bill savings, right? So from the customer perspective, this is some of what's important, but not all of it. You do have to buy the solar system in the first place. So another way you can try to look at these economics is to look at it as if it's an investment by the customer. Like, what kind of return are they getting on their investment? And so these charts Same thing, but framed that way, as in internal rate of return. And so to get these numbers, you have to make a number of different assumptions. I tried to use reasonable ones, but they're not going to be exactly right. So you have to say, how much is it going to cost to install the solar system? Are there tax credits? And how much do you expect electric rates in general to go up over the lifetime of your system? And so when you do that, you can see that for pretty much all of the solar systems here, annual net metering makes them a better deal. And it makes a net zero system where you're producing and using the same amount in a year the best deal. And you can also see, unsurprisingly, that solar systems are already a much better deal in places with more expensive power, Golden Valley being particularly notable here. So everything I've shown you so far just seems good. You change how this is done. It's a better deal for customers. They'll go out, they'll build bigger solar systems, they'll make clean power. So why haven't we done this already? Like what's the other side? Why is there any controversy at all? And that's kind of the next half of this. So all of this, lets customers invest and save energy and save gas. But whether it's annual net metering or just the monthly net metering we have today, it's always controversial, and it's often considered as a subsidy by the utilities. And why is that? The basic reason is that people with solar panels buy less power, and the amount of power people buy impacts other people's electric rates. That is just a fundamental property of how our electric rates work. It doesn't, however, follow from that the way these electric rates work are unfair. And then practically, on our grid, all of these impacts on other people's rates are tiny. They're just much too tiny to really even spend time thinking about, even if we ramp up the installation of rooftop solar substantially. So first, I want to explain kind of the basic premise here that gets people worried about things like rooftop solar, which is that if all other things are equal, if consumption drops, people buy less power, the overall cost to utility will go down and the rates will go up. So to try and understand that, we can take this hypothetical utility here, and all of its costs are divided up into variable costs and fixed costs. So variable costs are the costs that change with the amount of power that people use. So you use more, they go up, use less, they go down. Almost all of this is fuel cost. There's also some purchase power cost, and there's also some small amount of operation and maintenance costs that's variable. And for our utilities, that's roughly a third of all the total costs they have. Everything else is in that fixed cost bucket. It doesn't change based on the amount of power people use. A thing that tends to immediately jump to folks' minds here is linemen fixing power lines after a storm. And that is absolutely part of this, but it's not remotely the biggest part. A lot of this most of it really is just the cost of the stuff the utility has. So it's depreciation on everything, all of the power lines, all of the power plants, which is spreading out the cost of those things over time. It's the interest on the debt the utilities took on to build all that stuff. That's a lot of what's in that bucket. And so, what happens in this scenario if people drop their consumption? So, this is a hypothetical where power use is cut like in half. Half of it is gone. So you see there, what happens? Well, that blue piece doesn't change. That's the fixed cost. They, by definition, don't change if people use less power. So that's the same. And then the red drops in half because the power use dropped in half. And so in this situation, the utility gets 50% less revenue if they left their rates the same because they're basically charging per kilowatt hour and they have half as many kilowatt hours. But the costs only drop by 17%. So, to keep this working, they'd have to raise the rates. And one thing to note here is that actually, if everybody together all cut their use in half, they come out ahead, right? Their overall bills are going to be lower. But if there's one person who's just using the same amount of power they always did, and everybody else cuts their power use in half, then that person is going to have to pay a lot more. The rates will have to go up, and they use the same amount they always did, and they have higher bills. And that's and so one place that people go from there is to think, okay, that means that people who have solar panels on their house aren't paying their fair share of fixed costs. Like, that's our problem here is with these structures, we need everybody to pay the fixed costs of serving their house, and we couldn't have these kind of problems. But the problem with that, just kind of logically, there actually isn't a way to figure out the fixed costs of serving any particular house. That's not actually how it works. And, like I said, a lot of what's in that blue slice is things like debt on a power plant built 10 years ago. My house doesn't inherently have, owe any particular amount of that debt. We have to just figure out how to allocate responsibility for past decisions. And the way that's generally done is that you look at the different customer classes and figure out how much power each one uses and what their peak power use is, and use some formulas to try to figure out how to allocate that all and get rates. People argue over it every time it's done. You could go back to the regulatory commission filings from the Chugach rate case and see people arguing over that allocation for I think it was, 80 pages, just the summary of it the RCA put out in the end. So they're really, there's a reason that these things are per kilowatt hour, which is because, of course, if you had a system that was only going to use half as much power in the first place, you wouldn't build it like that. You'd build it with smaller power plants, smaller power lines, smaller everything. And so some of that responsibility is based on how much that class uses. Another thing to note here is that this isn't particularly about solar panels. This is about anything that changes load, right? So a mine closes down, same thing happens. People all buy more efficient washing machines, same thing happens. People, move away, same thing happens. Anything that reduces load can have this effect, and vice versa. Anything that increases load would have the opposite effect. And I kind of think that this ends up being brought up for net metering more than other things because it's a fairly recent way that people can, on an individual scale, use significantly less energy, and it requires this specific rate structure to happen. So it gets brought up for that in a way it doesn't tend to be for other ways power is cut. Like, I don't recall this sort of argument being made when the state was funding weatherization and efficiency programs. Nobody was worrying about what that would do to overall utility rates when people use less. And another probably more important thing is that I drew these circles with the power use being cut in half because I had to do that so you could kind of see it. This is not at all the scale we're talking about. The actual scale we're talking about is tiny, much more tiny than this, much too tiny to really be noticeable. So what happens if we do some real math here? So on the left side, that is the solar production from, rooftop solar, net metered systems on the Railbelt today in megawatt hours per year. And then on the right side is the revenue impact that has to utilities and the sales they lose theoretically from people buying that power, both now with those little light blue bars, and if we switched everybody to this net metering framework, so they could annual net metering framework, so they could just get credits for the whole year, move them from summer to winter. And you can see there that it's, significantly less than 1/10 of 1% of the money these utilities are collecting from their customers. It's not actually noticeable. In fact, it's well buried in the noise, and the only reason I can even do this math is that I can just estimate it from how much solar is being produced. It's not something that they'd even see, much less something that they would specifically go try to do a rate increase to make up for. Nobody's going to go and file for a 0.20% rate increase. But the reason I'm doing this is because for instance, the annual net metering bill that got introduced this year, there's a provision in there that says we're going to make this fund and the legislature is going to put money in it, and that money can be used to pay back the utilities for this lost revenue. So, if this increases the amount of solar that gets installed, the utilities are worried about that. So we want to make sure we can pay them back. And when the bill was introduced, it was presented that some utilities were not only worried about future impacts, but were worried about their current revenue losses from net metering. This, 1/20% losses. So, okay, but maybe they have a point. Like, what happens if you do get a lot more of these solar systems installed? Like, should they be worried about this? Should the other customers that aren't going to install solar be worried about this? So this is kind of a hypothetical chart showing what happens if 10 years from now, based on solar getting built out at different levels. So the current rate on the Railbelt in recent years, there's been about 2 megawatts of solar installed every year. So the current install rate says that continues. So you get about 2 megawatts of solar net metered every year and that just keeps going, then this is where we are in 2035. All the way on the other side is 10 times that amount. So you're just installing 20 megawatts of net metered solar every year for the next 10 years. And that is probably not even possible given our workforce. So if you increase the amount of solar that gets installed because you've made it a better deal with annual net metering, probably you end up somewhere in the middle there. So, you can see from the beginning what that does to the economics of the people who have it. What does it do for the utility? So on the left side there this is expressed in cents per kilowatt hour. So if this just happens and then the utilities make rate increases if they need to compensate for the lower sales, that's the rate increases. If you look on the right side, this is if the legislature instead wanted to prevent those rate increases by sticking money into this fund, how much would they have to spend to prevent them? So rate increases, if the installation rate doesn't increase, you're looking at, okay, 10 years from now, your rates might get raised less than a quarter of a cent. If installation just goes crazy, 10 years from now, your rates might get raised three-quarters of a cent. Really not very relevant. If you look at the right side, it's a little different. It's tens of millions of dollars a year. That's not nothing for the legislature to budget for something, especially given our current financial situation. And I think that difference kind of raises a point that gets lost and ends up being used for misleading arguments in pretty much anything that has to do with utility costs on the Railbelt, is that our utilities are nation scale small, but Alaska scale big. So all of the Railbelt electric utilities are collecting nearly $1 billion a year from their customers. So even so, when you talk about numbers like $1 million, $10 million, it sounds big, but it's actually a very small percentage of that overall scale of the Railbelt. Another thing to point out here in the calculations that I didn't mention earlier is there's, these different colored stripes. And that's because it's actually not really clear how you should calculate how much revenue utilities lose when people put up these solar panels. So I did it a few different ways. That dark bar there is just the difference between monthly net metering and annual net metering. So if monthly net metering is the baseline, the increased costs are just, okay, that power that was getting sold at the wholesale rate that was extra production now gets credited at the retail rate. That second bar is all the power that utilities can see coming off these systems. So the power they're usually looking over, say, a 15-minute interval at what's happening on the meter. And if there's a net export in that time chunk, the utilities will see that as power that got fed into the grid. And so that's all the power that they're seeing flow into the grid. And then that lightest line is really pretty hypothetical. So a lot of the way these calculations are done is just kind of thinking how much power people might have bought if they didn't have the solar panels. So that's including power that got used by the house that never flowed into the grid in the first place. And to even calculate that, you've got to assume that the customers, solar panels, are producing at the expected capacity factor. They don't have any trees in the way, nothing went wrong, and that their behavior is the same, that they use exactly the same amount after they put in the solar panels as before. And all of that is actually probably wrong, but that's what you have to guess if you were going to try to come up with a fund that pays utilities back for that. You don't really get to know that number. So I talked about that with this potential fund, with annual net metering. That's what's in that latest bill that got introduced this year. But the same kind of arguments come up and apply for everything else that's in net metering. So for instance, the Regulatory Commission filed to raise the cap, which is how much net metering in general, how much people are allowed to install grid-wide, to 20%. Same kind of arguments come up there. So this is a graph I put together specifically for HEA system in this case, but the same pattern applies to all the utilities. So all those middle three bars, different ways of calculating it, pretty much showing the same thing, the potential rate impact of net metering with a higher cap or with the current cap is basically nothing, way less than a cent, and other things matter a lot more. So when I was saying how decreases in consumption lead to increases in rates, well, that's true for efficiency too. So if you look over the last 15 years, the just general efficiency improvements that have occurred in people's houses over that time have actually made a substantially bigger difference. And if you look at what HEA did just in this last year, rate increase made a bigger difference. Pretty much all the utilities have done rate increases in the last year or so, or about to. And then maybe more importantly, thinking about the Cook Inlet gas crisis, changes in gas prices have a much bigger effect. Like I drew that 3 cents per kilowatt hour impact of gas being $12, and we're getting close to that. You know, Fury gas is more than that today, and as it filters in, that increases all of our costs. NSTAR, I think just last week filed to raise their, gas cost for everyone that buys from them to over $10. So the corollary to this not mattering for utility rates is kind of, well, does it matter at all? Like, why do we care? Like, are these net metering systems ever going to produce enough energy that we should be bothering to have policies that promote them? And so this, I took the annual kilowatt hour production estimated from current net metering, and also what the 20% cap would be from the RCA if that got met, and also all of those things I showed earlier, when you look 10 years out and based on different solar installation rates, what do you get to? And so it is small compared to the Railbelt as a whole. It's still a fairly small percentage, but it's not insignificant. It's certainly comparable to other utility scale projects that utilities put effort into getting, like Fire Island Wind, what the solar on the Kenai Peninsula was proposed to do, and Dixon Diversion there are all on the right side, kind of for comparison. So if you've got, significantly more installation, it would matter. I mean, the net metering today is already more than the utility solar we have today, even though it's pretty tiny. So kind of to sum it all up, if you switch net metering to an annual framework, it would make solar a better deal for customers because they'd be able to shift credits from the summer to the winter. And this would encourage larger installations because there'd be less of a hit from extra power produced in a month. So that extra power in June could be useful to you in December. And then for the economics on the utility side, any conservation of any kind can impact rates. This doesn't fundamentally make it problematic or unfair. That's how rates work. And however you calculate it, net metering impacts on the rates of people that don't have solar panels are really too tiny to matter, either now or in a reasonably conceivable near future, regardless of the rate structure, whether you have annual net metering or not. And though I didn't specifically mention it, you could do the same thing for community solar. The same arguments apply. It really doesn't matter very much. But if you actually did significantly increase the solar installations, you'd have more jobs for people installing it. You'd significantly help out the people who built it as far as their bills, and you would relevantly save gas and produce clean power. Um, and just one final point. This entire time I've been talking about economics. People often also bring up, if you connect solar panels to the grid, what about grid stability impacts? And I haven't forgotten about that, but the reason I didn't talk about it here is that it's not a general thing where it doesn't matter how much solar is on the grid in general for those impacts. That's a very location specific thing. So it matters what neighborhood the solar panels are in and what the constraints are in that neighborhood. And both current net metering structures and proposed annual net metering structures allow utilities the flexibility to say, hey, if any particular installation is going to mess with grid stability on this particular street, they can say no. So with that, that was a lot of information, a lot of graphs, very wonky. Hopefully people could follow. It is kind of a complicated topic, but thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that people have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Well, I'll just start by saying thank you, Erin, especially the methodical nature with which that you explain this wonky topic is really helpful for me to internalize what you're saying and then follow on to the next slide. And did a really great job, I think, of putting this all in context too. There's a number of questions that I have that, of course, I can ask after the fact. So I'll make sure that we try and get to our audience questions first and foremost. And just a reminder, if folks do have those, I saw that one ended up in the chat, and I have that stored away here. But if folks do have questions for Erin, please make sure to use the Q&A function so we can make sure those are asked and answered. So I'll start with Kate Wedemeyer's first question here. She said, our installer said we had to be a power provider, so it all goes directly to the electric company, and we do not take any of our solar energy directly. Can that be changed?
Um, that's interesting. As far as I know, at least I don't know how it works in every utility. At least on the HEA grid, they set up the older way to set up solar panels was kind of like that. They each had their own separate meter, so the solar didn't go to the house at all. It just went to a completely separate electric meter and right onto the grid. Um, More commonly, it's done the other way now, where you just have a bi-directional meter and then you have the solar panels, the house, and the grid in a line. I don't know. I guess if one of the utilities must still have that old format, and if they do, well, that's certainly something they can change.
Mhm.
But it must be utility policy, would be my guess.
It's a great question that I've not gotten before either. And maybe, yeah, certainly a question for the utility. And if they're open to it, perhaps developers as well. I know we've got a number in the chat here who've voice that they're attending the webinar, and I'm sure would be interested in working with folks if that's something that the utility is open to. The next question here is from an anonymous asker. It says, how much of the utility resistance is because they already have too much generation capacity? So I think that sort of gets into your point about the fixed costs associated with that.
It doesn't really matter, right? Because the basic thing I showed that this doesn't make much difference to utility finances one way or the other holds, right? And utilities actually generally aren't building generation even themselves because they need more capacity. They're building generation because they want to save fuel. So you actually, one of the reasons utilities have lots of generation capacity is within around the, say, 2012-ish timeframe, they pretty much all built new power plants or upgraded their existing ones to get more fuel efficiency, to save more fuel. And they're continuing to make those decisions today. That's kind of behind every utility's diversification efforts. It's behind Homer Electric's decision to upgrade part of a gas plant. So the fact that they have enough generation capacity doesn't matter to them for their own much larger decisions. They want to save fuel. And, you know, the home solar also saves fuel. So I don't think that that is really relevant.
Thank you. One question here from Gary Waltenbaugh, which is kind of related to a question that came to mind for me as well. So maybe I could try and wrap them together. But to read Gary's question off, would the summer to winter shift encourage customers to shift to more electric heating sources away from gas or diesel? Does it become more cost competitive to heat with electricity, such as a heat pump or other source? And does this have the potential to increase electric demand short or longer term? And the question I was going to ask is, am I right in remembering that we've seen in other jurisdictions that have annual net metering, but just more broadly, like rooftop solar adopters have actually shown that they'll increase their electric loads because they have EV chargers or other increased loads once they've adopted that technology?
I mean, basically, yes, of course it would. And so how much? It's hard to say. One interesting note, and it was kind of like I didn't bother going into the details on the graph, but back in 2020 or so, in one of the filings where Homer Electric was raising its net metering cap on the grid, they actually had a little bit of data they'd taken from customers before and after they got solar panels, how much electricity they used. And if you look at that amount and look at how much theoretically those panels should have produced, the difference is not nearly big enough. So either all of those installations were really crappy or they broke, or more likely there's actually some shifting, like people use more electricity. Either they got the solar panels because they were already planning to get a purchase that used more electricity, that, can't tell if it's an EV or a hot tub from the data, right? But so you can see that in that data. And then for heat pumps, I think the annual net metering would matter, especially for something like an EV. You don't necessarily use more of it in the winter and the summer. I mean, you do somewhat for battery temperature, but that's already going to be pretty beneficial to go along with solar. Heat pumps obviously have most of their use in the winter, so being able to shift that credits is going to matter more.
Thank you. This one's a bit broader. It says, how do the economics of solar change when the utility owns the entire project versus purchasing from an independent power producer versus shifting costs to customers via community solar? So any sort of like broader perspective on the differences in projects in that way?
Well, that's a big question. So first off, if a utility builds something, they're going to be, it's kind of a different framework. So if a person is putting something, the framework I use is kind of a conservation framework. So like that house is basically reducing its use. And even in the annual net metering, it couldn't really do that below zero, right? You get down to your use annually zero, then you're stuck. And so that's not really acting like a power plant. If a utility is going to build a solar farm or any type of energy, they're going to have the economy of scale and they're going to need it because they're going to be targeting that wholesale rate. Like they need to sell that to everybody else. So they want it to come in somewhere close to the wholesale rate they're paying for other power. And that is what independent power producer solar on the Railbelt today does. They're selling power to the utility for 7-ish cents. As far as the difference between an independent power producer building it and the utility building it, there's each model has strengths and weaknesses. So if a utility builds something, then there's no profit involved, so they don't have to pass on the business's profit costs. But if an independent power producer builds it, then it doesn't have to go on the utility's balance sheet. It doesn't have to take up as much of their staff time and efforts, and they may not have the expertise in that source of power. Community solar. I think community solar makes the most sense kind of as, it's kind of like if you think of it like the rooftop solar, it's just virtual. So, it would let people it's like you had a solar panel on your roof, but you don't actually have it. It's like in a field over there with several other people's solar panels. And you can get those credits, but you're not really being a power plant. You're just offsetting your own use. And that's kind of how it's been framed.
And then I guess maybe a follow-up to that too. You mentioned earlier that written within the bill is essentially a cap on the amount that an individual building owner could sell back to the utility, and that cap is sort of like their annual consumption. And it sounds like part of that is just because, they're not actual independent power producers, and you don't want to put the utility on the hook for purchasing power. Like that could be potentially a loophole that sort of allows or sidesteps negotiations that independent power producers normally go through with a utility. Could you just speak to the sort of like the reasonings why there might be that sort of cap in there?
Well, yeah, because if you had, I mean, if it was infinite, you could, there's also actual additional caps, just like the number of kilowatts of system you can install. So there's two ways to cap that. I think it's like 25 kilowatts or something. But if you didn't have anything like that, somebody could come along and say, I'm going to build 100 megawatt solar farm and I'm going to connect it to my house here. And then I'm going to net meter my 100 megawatt solar farm onto your grid and sell you all the power for 24 cents, even though you can buy or produce wholesale power for 8 cents elsewhere. And this would obviously um, not be good for the utility. It would not be good for the customers. That's the kind of thing that actually would make a big difference to people's rates. And if somebody is capable of going and building a 100 megawatt solar farm, they're going to get a lot of economy of scale. They should be able to do it for much cheaper.
Thank you. This one's from Ben May from Alaska Solar. He says, do we have any calculations on the savings from solar generation, keeping more natural gas in the ground and therefore decreasing the amount of liquefied natural gas that utilities will need with the upcoming gas shortfall?
Uh, Off the top of my head, no, I've done that. It's kind of interesting because it's sort of different for every utility and it depends on what kind of assumptions you make. So, like, Chugach is the best case for that because they literally have their own stockpile of cheaper gas that's limited. So, if they save up that cheaper gas for later, then they gain the price difference between that Beluga River gas that they own and the imported gas they'd have to buy otherwise. So there's an additional um, benefit to the utility. It would show up in my graphs as um, like even lower revenue losses. Now that's less clear for cases like Golden Valley. They're pretty much their marginal power source is oil, and it's going to cost what it's going to cost they can't really save up cheap oil for later. And then you get a utility like uh, HEA or MEA that just buys gas on contract. It's possible that the price they'll get later will be cheaper if less Cook Inlet gas is used now, but it's not so straightforward exactly how that would work because it's going through a third party contract. But I can follow up with those numbers if anyone wants them.
Maybe just another plug then for alaskaenergy.org. That's where Erin obviously shares a lot of her great analysis and write-ups on the implications of decisions we might make for our energy systems across Alaska. I've got a question here that I'm digging out of the chat from Charles Barnwell. And it says, is going off the grid a wise move, given that rates may go up due to various causes, e.g. fuel costs to the utility, and given that most of the utilities cost is fixed, maybe instead of a person paying for the utilities gas infrastructure, they instead could pay for their own energy infrastructure, e.g. solar panels.
I think when people say this, they're often forgetting that, we're here talking about electricity today, but electricity is actually probably the smallest part of your personal energy consumption. So heat and transportation are much bigger. So if you go off grid, you pretty much, without that, ability to be connected to the grid in the winter, you're never going to be able to either heat your house or drive your car with your own energy. So you will still be tied to the fossil fuel infrastructure, still be tied to the expensive gas where, if you have natural gas, NSTAR is raising its gas costs 11% and its other costs like 25%. And then the same goes for, buying gasoline for your car. So I think actually the best solution is have the solar panels, stay connected to the grid, and get the grid itself to get off the fossil fuels, because then we can potentially get the rest of our energy free from those increased costs as well.
Well said. And then I think, that in my mind, that goes to not only policy solutions like this, which makes it a bit more affordable for folks to do so. So then you can help to shift the grid in that way, but also, elect great utility board members such as Aaron and others that REAP will share information about after the fact. I guess I'll just round out then in sort of like that policy context. There is a question here, just a reminder for what the House bill number is, and any final thoughts on that policy, but then also any final thoughts or takeaways, Aaron, before we wrap up here with a few minutes left in today's webinar.
Yeah, so that bill number is House Bill 164, and my thoughts are that making it net metering annual is good. The part of that like sets up this pay the utilities back fund is silly, but not necessarily bad. I mean, I think the good side of that is that, if you're forced to do the math, then the utilities would have to go to the legislature and ask them, hey, can you save us from a 0.1% rate increase? And the legislature can say no. And so maybe that cuts off some of the misleading arguments about costs, but I'm not so sure about that piece.
Great. Well, thank you again, Aaron, for providing the necessary context here. As we were saying before we began today's webinar, I really hope that this is, one, a reminder of the great resource that you have on alaskaenergy.org, which of course we'll share a link to in the follow-up resources, and also just a conversation starter for not only annual net metering, but just other ideas that have been put forward for ways that we can sort of drive collective action with small tweaks, whether through policy or just our own individual actions, as we think about keeping energy costs low across the Railbelt and, specifically sort of advocating for the development of our local renewable energy resources as well as energy efficiency. So we've got a minute left here. Just want to thank Aaron once more and also all of the folks who attended this afternoon during the lunch hour on a Wednesday. Really appreciate your engagement with this series and your interest in these important topics. If you are aligned with our mission, please consider taking a look at the REAP website, perhaps becoming an organizational member, supporting us individually, but Stay tuned for the final installment in our Spring Energy Speaker Series 2 weeks from today, where we'll talk about the ETIP program that REAP runs here in the state of Alaska and some really inspiring stories, and also just more information about the work that's being done in Alaska's rural communities to do just that, harness their local renewable energy resources and sort of make their local energy systems more efficient so that they work for folks in those communities. But with that, it's 1 p.m., so we'll let you go, get back to what you were doing beforehand. Thank you all once again, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.